for the emergency board.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, Faith. The only question I have, Faith, is, well, you and I can talk another time, but I'm happy to try to help. Madam
It'd
Chair.
stay on when we adjourn.
Great, thanks, Chris.
That would work. Okay, we are
You're
now
live.
streaming live, so I'm going to call the meeting to order. This is Senate Finance, January 19th, 2021. And we've got an abbreviated meeting today so that the chair can go to the emergency board and get the official revenue numbers. We've got online right now Maria Royal, who's our ledge counsel, who drafted whatever we did last year. And I thought it would be helpful to go through the final work product that we passed out regarding broadband. So before we start saying, no, we required these speeds and those speeds, to go over and see what we actually did. I don't know who this is. I think it's the second notice for at least the 100th time on my car warranty. Anyway, Maria's going to go over that, and then some questions came up Friday about how much money is left from the money that was allocated for broadband, and Steve Klein is going to fill us in on that. So I want us to all start at the same spot, and then we can go from there. Okay, so Maria.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Sorry I arrived late. I was using an expired link. Just took me a while to recover.
Ours come in new every day, unlike some other sessions.
Thanks.
All right.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Maria Royal with Legislative Council. And I'm going to share my screen. I have a document to review with you. Let's see. Okay, and does that appear for everybody in a reasonable format?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So as the chair mentioned, we are going to review all of the broadband programs that you funded last session with CRF, Coronavirus Relief Fund dollars. There are essentially, oops, let's go back. Okay, so the legislation that we're going to be looking at, and this is really just to review and make sure we're all looking at the correct authorization and the criteria for the various programs. So most of the programs were enacted as part of Act 137. You will recall that this bill allocated a significant amount of CRF money, not just to broadband, but to housing and economic relief as well, about upwards of $200 million of the total $1.25 billion that came to the state. You then made some tweaks to those programs in the big bill, Act 154, which was enacted on October 2nd, and also had some additional appropriations there. So those are the two pieces of legislation, just to provide the largest context. So the first kind of umbrella program that I'm going to be talking about, this is in section 13 of Act 137, what's known as the Accelerated Broadband Connectivity Program, the ABC program. I said umbrella program because there are about 5 kind of sub-programs that we will review in detail that are part of this program. These next few slides are some general provisions that apply to all 5 of those sub-programs. These are the broadband grant programs, if you will. The other kind of planning related, recovery planning provisions are in other sections, and we'll address those after we go through these. But in terms of some of the general provisions that apply to all of your broadband programs, and again, just a refresher, this is about $17 million that you appropriated. And just also to remind you, in terms of the purpose based on the Treasury guidance and the CARES Act law, as you know, all of these expenses needed to be necessary in terms of dealing with and responding to the pandemic. Obviously unbudgeted, you could not backfill any budgets. And then the real kind of somewhat of an obstacle for broadband large projects is this requirement that they have been incurred during the covered period, which started March 1st and ended December 30th. So that was your big constraint for broadband deployment because of equipment, all of the pre-build, pre-construction work that's required, and time-consuming labor issues, etc. So you were working within those confines. Obviously, that December 30th deadline as of December 27th was extended for a year, but this is what you were working with back last session. So as I said, 5 programs and initiatives. We'll go through those in details. We're still on the general provisions. All of these programs had.
Madam Chair,
Yep.
can I ask a
Yeah.
question? Just out of curiosity, it may be a dumb question, but it seems like in housing renovation, which could be more complicated than putting up wires, they managed to get all their money out the door and spent and constructed within the 6-month period. What is the unique challenge of broadband, of why it was so hard to get this done by December 30th?
So there may be many variables, some that I'm not familiar with. One of the big issues, a lot of the companies said that they had already planned their construction for 2021, and they were doing their make ready work, pole attachments, identifying the poles that they wanted to attach their wires to, replacing any utility poles that needed to be replaced in preparation, and just going through that pole attachment process. I don't remember on average, obviously it depends on the scale of your project, but it can take many months just to do that make ready work. So you are looking at a 6-month start to finish construction period. And so just doing the pole attachment and preparing that work alone, may have brought you right up, to the deadline. And then, some of the other issues, certainly some of the challenges that arose because of the pandemic, obviously lots of states are investing in broadband. So the access to equipment, to fiber, I think that may have been a supply shortages that companies dealt with. And I think part of that's because, they were buying that already, in 2020 for what they were planning in 2021. The other issue is weather. I think I remember in this committee when you were talking about doing pole harvesting data, and wanting to get money right away so that you could start doing some projects. They were talking about November, December. You really can't do much beyond that because you just can't count on the weather being favorable. So, probably other issues as well, but I think those are the big ones that tended to come up. So I hope that addresses.
Thank you for that.
Madam Chair?
Sure.
I can't see you, so.
Okay. Maria, this is Chris Bray. Can you, on the previous slide, it said incurred by whatever, 12/30/20. And I'm just wondering precisely what incurred means. Does that mean you signed the contract, but you haven't finished all the construction, or what does that mean?
Unfortunately, it had a very narrow interpretation based on the Treasury guidance. And actually on the next screen, you see the guidelines. That in part is taken from the Treasury guidance that you had to have significantly increased broadband capacity for the big 3 distance learning, telehealth, telework, within the covered period. So that means you had to make service available, not just signed a contract for construction that could happen in 2021, but you had to make the service available in response to the pandemic. And at that time, it was contemplated that that needed to be done by December 30th. So that was a big challenge. I think
Sure.
everyone universally agreed.
Just to ask one more question about how people may have finessed this or not. If you were building out new service to 100 customers, but you had only turned on customer number one, like you did all the general infrastructure for everyone, you got one person over the line and a working connection going. Was that enough for you to check that box and say, we made it? Or did you have to complete everyone on your project?
I think that's open to interpretation, but I look, and we're just basing this on guidance that's been provided. So the significantly increased capacity, I would say if you just got one person out of hundreds, you probably haven't met the, requirement. So there may be some discretion there. I think the Treasury, the department allowed for that, and over time said, look, we know that there are labor shortages, we know that there are supply shortages, and so there was this greater flexibility to try to address that. We know that even if your project was completed, it might take up to 3 months just to process the claims and get the payment out. So those factors were certainly recognized to try to allow for some of that, but I think at the time the intent was your project is completed. And then, of course, as I think this committee is aware, with respect to the broadband programs in particular, there was a hard stop of January 1st. You had a sunset to this program. It's not on this particular slide. I think the next slide. And so that, based on all of the information you had last summer, last fall, you were looking to end this program. And then whatever available funds came to you, or additional funds came from the federal government, to then go forward and decide how you want to spend those, but you had a hard stop. So that's one of the issues that was addressed and is being addressed, as in I think it's 36, which I think is on the notice calendar, Senate Appropriations Committee bill that essentially allows the commissioner to proceed with projects that were under contract before December 20th. Because as you know, many of those projects were not completed. So kind of a technical change. And that's a very long way of answering, I think, your question, Senator Bray. Apologize for that.
Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, just to add a couple of comments. One regarding the projects being finished by December 30. There were some 18 projects I know that I've looked at that were on this list within this number. And of those, only 2 were actually complete by December 30th. And the guidance changed during the course of the year, Maria, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there came a point in time, and I think it was around November, maybe a little bit earlier, that allowed projects that were underway to be able to be continued if there was a shortage in the supply chain, an error in the supply chain, for example. Well, that's been interpreted to be the supply chain, or in a number of cases, folks said they didn't have the labor necessary in order to complete the project. So it wasn't just supply, and we knew in midsummer that there was a long lead time in order to get fiber. So that was problem one. I think it was December that the guidance changed to allow projects to continue beyond December 30th. And that's what I think the bill that Approps has dealt with is designed to deal with, because our bill did not cover anything after January 1. There is still a question, though, that's unresolved right now as to whether people, and this goes to Chris's question, I think, did people actually get the service? And I asked this question of the commissioner in early mid-December, and it took forever, and I got an answer back, which is still not entirely clear, but it appears as if The issue is delivering the service so that the customer can get it, but there's not necessarily any equipment in the customer's home. And so the department is not able to tell us how many people actually got internet. So we could have a situation in which we sent wires or signal out to 1,000 homes and nobody at all connected to it. And we don't know the answer to that question, which is kind of concerning.
I think we're starting to repeat some of our discussion from Fridays. I'd like to let Maria get through hers. When we did the bill, we were operating under the assumption, as it had been told to us, I assume with the vetting of Guidehouse, that we couldn't do the pole harvesting, we couldn't do the get ready work, which normally takes a good 6 months. It had to be service up and at least available, but the wire or pole, whatever it was, had to be up and operational by the end of the year. And that was my recollection as to where we started and what we were doing. Okay, Maria, why don't you?
I think that's exactly right. And I think Senator Brock, the Treasury guidance, I think the language is actually pretty general. Wasn't just supply chain issues or labor. I think it was any issue that delayed construction that was beyond the control of the state.
Yep.
So those were certainly examples of things that, you know, your intention could have a project complete by December 30th, but things beyond your control may have interfered with that. Okay, so let's go back and, oops. Okay, so significantly, I think an issue that's come up with this committee certainly last year and this year, in terms of the speed requirements for these programs, you required that any new services be capable of a minimum of 25.3 megabits per second. You also added, however, your intent that when feasible, priority should be given to 100 symmetrical service. So 25.3 is the minimum. You'd have to provide at least that, but then guidance to the department that if it's feasible, if you can get it built within I think that was kind of the big issue, the construction time frame, you know, that you provide 100 symmetrical service. You also required that there be a public database maintained by the department that shows the location and capacity of any infrastructure funded through these programs. You had provisions that the existing telecommunications and connectivity advisory board, as well as affected CUDs, receive notice of any projects. The commissioner was authorized to override any CUD objection, provided she put her reasons in writing. I don't believe, based on the commissioner's testimony, that there were any objections raised by the CUDs. Then you had other provisions, again, just general provisions that allowed for some advance payments, that funds be retained until the project is incurred and properly documented. You asked the department to coordinate with other stakeholders with respect to all of these programs, including Velco and FirstNet, to leverage any existing broadband assets. There was a monthly reporting requirement. Senator Brock is very familiar with that through JITALK. A general confidentiality provision for, you know, a lot of the data that was collected had to do with households, you know, telehealth, remote working needs, any information that was personally identifiable was kept confidential. And then, of course, the two big issues, given the time frame, any unexpended funds revert to the state on December 20th. The program sunsets January 1st. So just to be perfectly clear, And we can look at the amendment, if you haven't already seen the language that's in S36, we can review that. That authority pertains to spending this money for these programs only for contracts that were entered into prior to December 20th. The commissioner has discussed and brought up the fact that there are unobligated funds, that there are residual funds available. And I think the figure is about $3.6 million. And Steve Klein can just address that based on the information that he has. So that money is available to you, to the legislature, to decide if you want to continue any of these programs, change the criteria, or whatever else the state's needs may be. But I just wanted to make sure there's a distinction there, and that's hopefully clear. So with respect to the 5 programs, one was the line extension program. This was up to $2 million. This was you're not far from a cable network or a fiber network, you're a mile, 2 miles, whatever away, and they can quickly install a line. This was specifically meant to give money to help with any the customer costs of that line extension. As you know, for example, with cable companies, if you don't have the density, if you have less than, I don't know if it's 5 or whatever, I'm just not sure, but if you don't have a certain threshold of households over a mile, then the customers are responsible for some of the construction costs. So this allowed the customers to avail themselves of some state dollars to help pay for line extensions. So the cap was set at $3 million. Oh, God, I wish. $3,000. There's a requirement that the locations provide data that they have remote learning, telehealth, or telework needs. There was a provision for healthcare providers and schools to apply for this money on behalf of their patients or students, respectively, and also a requirement that these line extensions be the most cost-effective and site-appropriate line extension. In other words, you couldn't apply for underground conduit where an aerial option was available. And that's, obviously given the limited funds. Then there was the Get Vermonters Connected Now initiative. These funds, when used the infrastructure of the existing connectivity initiative, this money went directly to ISPs for a very specific purpose, though, to offset the customer costs of fiber to the premises installations, including underground conduit where required and service drops. And you'll see what this is getting at based on the priority that you specified, that there is prioritization for underground conduit projects to low-income households with remote learning, telehealth, and telework needs. So I believe that the issue that came up here that you were trying to address was there may be mobile home parks where, based on permitting requirements, any connection to broadband need to be underground. You can't do the above ground aerial connections, which is very expensive. And so it could be many households, many families within those communities who then don't have access because it's cost prohibitive. So the attempt was, there are existing fiber routes that go by such places, and that this money would be available to get them connected, to get that service. And that's something that you deemed achievable within a relatively short amount of time. And obviously you've heard from the department on all of these programs. And so I'm really just reviewing what the criteria were. So then you also asked the department to establish, to the extent administratively feasible, a temporary broadband lifeline program. This is the subsidy program specifically to help customers with their monthly subscriptions. Assuming that some people would have trouble financially paying those bills, this would provide some financial assistance for at least a short period of time. during the pandemic. And then you have, you
Yes.
allowed yes,
Maria, sorry to interrupt. A
yes,
quick question.
no problem.
Is there a dollar figure for that program number 3 there, temporary broadband lifetime?
You did not specify one. I believe, though, if I'm not mistaken, I think the department said that they were giving a $40 credit, monthly credit. I'm just looking at my notes, so somebody will correct me if I'm wrong.
And when does that credit end?
Well, I believe it's ended already.
Okay.
I don't know, this is one of those, oops, let me just go to the other screen so it's not too confusing. This
I know
was,
that
it
a
could only
lot
be
of the
funded.
ISP, yeah, a lot of the
Correct.
ISPs were also doing free hookup, forgiveness of back bills if you've disconnected. There were a whole bunch of programs, and it's probably good to spend a day finding out what those were. They had different time frames, and just get a handle on what was, what is, and how many people remain hooked up.
You're absolutely right. A lot of providers did offer programs, either free or discounted service. Some of them have expired, some of them have continued. I think, Senator Bray, I think this temporary Lifeline, broadband Lifeline program, I think that has expired, because that's the money just ran out. The money was, allocated until January 1st. But let me double check that, if you will. This isn't considered one of those broadband projects that was in progress, that was not completed. So I don't think it falls under the amendment that you're going to be voting on. So if you wanted to continue this program, you may need to specifically authorize its continuation and specify how much money you want to put towards it.
Well,
But
thank you.
let me just confirm that.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I'm thinking of Senator Brock's questions from before with if we set people up, get them going, and then pull the plug financially on them, how many people will figure out a way to continue? Or we, creating uncertainty and disruption in their life by helping them get started, but not helping them make it all the way through the pandemic.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think it's a good point. And just also just to be aware, and I think you know this already, there is additional federal dollars in the last stimulus bill that was set aside for a broadband subsidy program for low-income households. And the details of that program have not yet been worked out. I think it's $3.2 billion. But I don't know. I think that doesn't address your issue, because that money would only cover a short amount of time as well. And so what happens after that, whether it's continued or not, it's not really clear. But that's just to kind of flag that issue, that's potentially some additional monies that might be available for these households.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So then you also allowed the department to distribute some of this broadband funding through the existing connectivity initiative. This is a state program, a grant program that does RFPs, reviews proposals by internet service providers to build out in unserved and unserved areas. Again, the big hurdle here was the completion date of December 30th. But this could be for any project that met the 25.3 speed requirement. There are other criteria for that program. Not sure. I think that I'm not sure that those criteria are necessarily relevant to this discussion. I think you're probably familiar with the existing initiative.
Maria?
Yes, yeah.
So just going back to the Lifeline program of sorts, I realize that there's no money to continue paying January and February's bills at this time, though maybe we can find it somewhere, but is there a moratorium on shutting down access to broadband for those folks, as there apparently is in other utilities?
No, so we're gonna talk about the PUC's moratorium on involuntary disconnections, which you're right, did not apply to broadband. The arrearages program that you set up, which we will also review today because you use the CRF money. The FCC encouraged providers to take what was called a Connect America pledge. It was voluntary, where they voluntarily basically pledged not to disconnect individuals based on their inability to pay during the pandemic. I think a lot of those programs, which again were voluntary, have been discontinued, but I can follow up on that and get a better sense.
What was the authority for the moratorium on utility disconnects?
For the PUC's moratorium,
Yeah.
that was based on the PUC's jurisdiction over the utilities. And let's see. So that applied to voice plain old telephone service in the telecom world, also to electric companies, natural gas, and then I believe also you expanded it to include water. But I think it had to do because these are utilities regulated by the state. There's some additional authority that the state has for the provision of service and ensuring that it's not, as you know, there are many more consumer protections in general that are available to consumers regarding disconnections of service in general. You can't disconnect somebody's electricity in the winter or if they have a health need. So there's just greater jurisdiction. I can't point you off the top of my head. Not sure I could identify a specific statutory source, but I can certainly look into that a little bit more.
So are you saying that the Public Utility Commission would not have the authority to extend the moratorium to the broadband Lifeline recipients?
So yes. So if it just forget about Lifeline, but just discontinuing broadband service, I do not believe the PUC has the authority. I think it was questionable whether the FCC had the authority to do that, given its reclassification of broadband as an information service, which is, I believe, in part why the FCC just asked providers to take a pledge and it was voluntary. So, I mean, you're raising the fundamental issue in communications about who has regulatory authority over broadband and for what purposes. So the FCC didn't assert that authority. Again, that was voluntary, you know, and because of the reclassification of broadband as an information service, the state has very limited regulatory authority. There is some consumer protection authority, but that's, you know, that's a pretty gray area.
We would have we went ahead and did a moratorium on evictions. If we were to do a moratorium on this, you think we would run into preemption issues?
I think you would definitely run into them, but the point is well taken. This is probably the most fundamental issue in the communications industry right now, and that's the jurisdictional question between recognizing that there may be changes under a new administration, right? There may be a reclassification. I don't know. But just if things were just stopped where they are right now for regulatory purposes, at what point does a state have its traditional police powers to enact measures to protect its residents, irrespective of the FCC's stated policy of not regulating broadband like a utility? That, that question will raise, I can almost say with certainty, preemption issues. How it's resolved going forward would depend on many factors, and be based on the testimony that you take. How does it impact the market? How does it impact interstate business? How would it protect consumers? What are the consumer issues that are at stake? That balancing, trying to, think through that. Yep.
I'm actually not thinking in terms of federal jurisdiction or technical preemption issues and long-term implications. I'm thinking that we're very much in the pandemic now as we were in the summer. Could the governor, for instance, issue an executive order and just say, we have a crisis here. People need these things as lifelines. You cannot discontinue the service. I mean, I think there's been a lot of outreach of the executive authority in terms of the pandemic ongoing, and we're continuing policies tied to when that state of emergency is declared over. I guess I would like to know if the legislature called on the governor to produce an executive order to stop any kind of shutdowns of at least poor people on broadband. Is there no legal authority within the executive branch to do that?
Yeah, so
Michael?
I am not up to date on the governor's authority, even in an emergency, to take actions of that nature. I'd have to look at that a little bit more, irrespective of the broadband issue. But why don't I look into that a little bit more and just see if I can get some clarity.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to move us along. I'm watching. This is a review of what we did. It looks like we are going to spend a day finding out if the service providers are in fact disconnecting people. We're going to spend a day looking at the cost of not collecting. When we put in, we had a fund to cover the cost of not collecting arrearages in the electric field. So we're going to have a day to look at this. I think we should find out if there's a problem and then find out what the solution is. But I think we do need to move on it very quickly because kids are supposed to be going to school. But Maria, can we finish walking through what we did last year?
Yep.
Because after this, you have the exciting 45 minutes on, we've got Steve still to tell us where the money is, and then we've got common level of appraisal. And I don't want you to miss that excitement.
Well, I don't want to come between the committee and common level of appraisal. So
I wouldn't either.
I know I'll go, I think we can go through this relatively quickly. So
Can I ask one really quick question before we leave this neighborhood?
Yeah.
And that is the same kind of prohibition on regulating broadband. Doesn't that apply to cell service as well?
Yes.
Cell service, you mean voice service?
Yeah. Right.
Yes, there's a little more authority with respect to cell service. You can't control the rates, you can't regulate the entry into markets, but there's some authority over the terms of service. So
I'll leave it alone there. I'm just thinking of so many people have dropped landlines. there's another whole vulnerable population if they can't afford to keep their cell service going too.
Yeah.
We'll get an update on
Yep.
those programs. Okay.
Okay, so you had some money for Wi-Fi deployment. I don't think there's much to say about that. Those are Wi-Fi hotspots at the department installed. Okay, so now we're moving on to the planning provisions. We're outside of the specific broadband funded services. You had money that was allocated for the CUDs to help with their recovery planning. You can see there, initially you appropriated 800,000. The amendment was based on the amendment in the big bill. So that's what those amendments are. But so you can see what you originally appropriated and then what you ultimately appropriated in the big bill. So $2.3 million grant program. And you also increased the cap so that each CUD could get up to $400,000. And these are, again, the recovery planning efforts of CUDs could be for consultant fees, administrative expenses. And I think there's an attempt to also try to, if it continues, if one of the things that was raised is perhaps using some of this money for poll harvesting data that will help with any planning for future deployment projects. So then I believe you've already heard, you got a walkthrough of the telecom recovery plan. So I won't go into that in any detail. And as you know, the 10-year telecom plan is due June 30th, and that comes with a $250,000 appropriation. You set up a telehealth connectivity program. You can hear from VPQHC. I believe they're prepared to present, if this committee wants to, the outcome of that program. Then you gave some money to PEG Access for their pandemic activities. You also you have a study coming on the AMOs, Access Media Organizations, and their long-term financial stability. That you didn't actually appropriate money, and ACCD was not able to come up with money in the summer. So you, in the big bill, appropriated $100,000 for this study. So you can see the due date was January 15th, but because the money wasn't available, it delayed things, and so there's been an extension, at least informally. So you'll be getting probably a progress report soon. The arrearages, the utility rate pay arrearages, the only thing, and you've probably read about this and you're familiar with what happened here. This is the money for people experiencing financial hardship with their utility bills. So the department found that because there was the moratorium on involuntary disconnections, a lot of people were not necessarily signing up to get this money to help pay for their programs because they didn't need to. They weren't being confronted with the bill because their service was not being disconnected. So the moratorium actually was lifted on October 15th. At that point, when people were faced with their bills, then they were able to start processing, contacting the department, working with the utilities, taking advantage of these dollars. And that kind of got that program going. Since that time, the moratorium has been reinstated, was reinstated November 22nd, and will last through March 31st. You have money for cybersecurity. Not going to talk about that through Agency of Digital Services. Not something I've really worked on. You had money for 911 for their pandemic activities. In terms of other provisions in the big bill, you gave some money directly to CUDs to help pay for their portion of a project if they applied through VITA's lending program, the Broadband Expansion Loan Program. And when you created that program a couple of years ago, all ISPs are required to provide a 10% match, basically, or cover 10% of the project costs. This money was basically to help the CUDs because they are having trouble even coming up with the 10%. So this hopefully will help them secure financing. through VITA, and you extended the deadline for the broadband innovation grant program. So that is an overview of all of the 2020 broadband programs.
No, yeah. We were having some technical difficulties, but I know that will be posted. So folks can review it at their leisure. Senator Sorokin, do you have your hand up or is that an old hand?
I'm just yawning.
No, I've got a
Oh,
yellow
thanks.
hand. Yeah, I can't take them down. I need you to take them down.
I am sorry, that was my first venture into blue hands.
Normally I can take down blue hands, but not yellow hands. So see, Steve Klein is here. So I'm gonna have some question came up about how much money is there left. So I was gonna have Steve go over that, and then we're gonna go on to Jill Remick and Jake Feldman and common level of appraisal. So Steve.
Yeah, Steve
there
Klein
you
from George Fiscal. And so I'll do a very short version, and then you can bring me back some other time if you want to go more. But we looked at it on Friday and went through all their numbers with the department. And they have about 3.63 million of available funds. And this is after the language that you corrected, the language that the Senate Appropriations Committee is doing that says that I'm not counting that. That's being spent. That's money that's obligated. But unobligated available money is about 3.6 million divided between the various lines. And I have it broken out by lines. I think Maria made a really good point. I just want to flag this. The way this language from your committee or from in this program was drafted in a very strict way, that more strict than many of the other CRF funds. And one of the things it said is any unspent funds on December 20th shall be returned to the CRF fund. So under the way the law was written, that 3.6 million should have just gone poof and gone back to CRF and been available for everything else the state might want to use it for. But what the administration did, and I think after talking with the Joint Fiscal Committee, is it basically froze the money. So if your money was in an account, like in an appropriation at that time, they did not take it out, put it back in the CRF. So this money, if you were to want to spend it, you would still have to draft something, notwithstanding the language that you put in before. But the number that you have in your little world that's sort of in your hands is the 3.632. There's more CRF money that's unobligated. There's more CRF money in other pots around the state that could be put into broadband. So, there's a lot of flexibility, and I don't want to, maybe I'll stop there. If you want me to go through detail of which ones there's money and which aren't, I can do that later. And you're in a time crunch.
And Steve, if I'm remembering correctly, that the administration did rescind that money, and Joint Fiscal at that point said, we're close enough to the session that we wanted to keep any unspent CRF money to go through the appropriations process.
Right. So they did propose to rescind it. We didn't. You're right. Exactly. They proposed it. We didn't do it.
Right. But it can't be sent out in another contract, right? Without.
Right. Right now, the underlying law, and Maria is better at this than I am, is that money cannot be spent because you're past December 20th.
Okay. Senator Brock.
Just a question regarding the 3.6 million. Are there restrictions on that money much in the same way that there are restrictions on CARES money generally? For example, it can't be spent on anything long-term, I assume?
Yeah, it's still bound by the overall CARES money restrictions, which are now different than they were before. Now you can spend it up to for anything that gets spent before December 31st, 2021. So you have a lot more time. The budget restriction is old news. You don't really worry about that. But yes, you still have to use it for the things that are related to the pandemic. And, Maria, the guidelines haven't changed. The only big change is you have a lot more time.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Bray.
Steve, so the appropriations fall into different buckets, like sections 13, 14, 15, 16, et cetera.
Mhm.
The money that the 363, does it have to stay within those buckets, or could all be thrown into one of the buckets if the committee went that direction?
Yeah, so the point is that it's all in your hands now, because you're correct. The money is not left all from one bucket. The money is left in various buckets, but since it can't be spent without your authorization, if you said, take that full 3.63 and give it to housing, you could do that. You could also give it to one of those lines. Whatever you do, you have to put the language in to make it happen. But the world is stopped. So this money is stopped and left in it's like musical chairs. They're all sitting in the chair that they're sitting in at the time when the music stopped. But you're now going to have to take an action to get them out of their chair, and you can put them wherever they want.
Thank you.
Senator Hardy.
Thank you. And thanks, Steve and Maria. Maria, your presentation was extremely helpful for me as someone who was not on the committee last year. So thank you very much. Just one really quick clarifying question and then a larger question. You mentioned the telecom recovery plan, which was supposed to be specific to recovery during COVID. Is that the plan that we got the presentation on last Friday from Matt Dunn and his partner?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then I am almost a little worried to ask this question because I don't want to open a can of worms. But I didn't hear clearly in the information we got last week about, for example, how many people applied for the LECAP or the line extension program that were denied because there wasn't time or there wasn't funding. Do we have that information anywhere?
I think the department provided the information. I don't know if they provided it in this committee. They certainly have it. They have their reports where they summarized all the work that they did. So roughly, I think they got maybe like 400 applications. About half of them were granted and the money went out. And about half of them were denied either because there wasn't enough time to do the line extension. I think also they said they didn't, if it was a second home and there wasn't an identifiable need, health or schooling, that they were not deemed eligible. So I think a little over 200 line extensions were made and another 200 plus were not deemed eligible.
Okay. Do you think that was in the presentation they gave us last week? I didn't catch that from their presentation.
I don't know. I actually wasn't here for that, but I saw a presentation that they did earlier in the week. So you know what? Why don't I know exactly where it is in a report that they provided. So I will cut and paste and send it to you.
That would be great. Thank you.
Sure.
Brock.
Maria, you may be able to answer this. I'm not sure, but we allocated $500,000 for this emergency broadband plan. And I know that somewhere in the budget, we're talking about $250,000 availability for the long-term 10-year telecommunications plan. Is it feasible to allocate some of the excess money we have to planning in a more general way for a longer period of time? In other words, for this calendar year that would apply to it, as opposed to the 10-year plan, in order just to get some more money in for planning than we have right now available, which is simply $250.
When you say, is it feasible?
Is it possible, based on what you think Guidepost or whatever the name of that firm is, would allow us to do?
So yeah, I think you could make that decision certainly, just like you had some recovery planning already. I think you could, yes, it's a plan that you already requested and that was in the works, but I think you could certainly make the case that because of the pandemic, because of its ongoing nature, because of the extended deadline, that additional CRF monies could be made available. So, you know, that's just off the top of my head, but I will look into that as well.
Thank you.
Okay, and I'm going to have to wrap this because our next witnesses, I think, have a hard stop. They may need to go to the e-board at 3. So Senator Sorokin, do you have a really quick question?
I have a question, but it's not really quick.
Okay, then if you can hold it or email it to Maria. Because I want to move on to Jill and Jake. Thank you, Maria.
Okay, you're welcome.
We now know what we did. And it sounds simpler when it's represented than it did when we did it. But Jake and Jill Remick are here, and they were going to walk us through common level of appraisal, which probably won't be as exciting.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jill Remick. I am the Director of Property Valuation and Review at the Tax Department.
Jake,
Oh,
you're
so-
muted.
Sorry about that. Jake Feldman,
There you go.
Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Tax Department.
And I also have roped in Christy Wright. You can see her name down there. I know she's on the road, but in case I really need to dig into the depth of the equalization study, she oversees that work as well and works in partnership with Jake. So she's on to set me straight if I set you folks astray. All right, now I'm going to see if I can share.
Madam Chair,
Senator McDonald has a question. Yes.
just, we have people with great knowledge about to explain something to us. One of the things that often happens is when before going into the technical explanations, they don't tell us what the problem is that the thing that they're explaining tries to solve. Thank you.
Right, so just for context, last week you folks heard a great deal from Chloe Wexler about education funding. And I was able to listen in on your testimony later, one of the beauties of the YouTube recording. And so I was able to jot down some of the questions you had for us. She was explaining how the tax rate is calculated, how the common level of appraisal is applied to the tax rates. So Jake is definitely very well versed in the calculations and works closely with the Joint Fiscal Office to make those calculations in concert with the Agency of Education. My division at Property Valuation Review in the Tax Department carries out a couple main functions related to this. But for the purposes of this conversation, we do the annual equalization study that's required as of Act 60 and Act 68. And what that means is they actually do a review with each of the towns in the state every year, all of the sales for that current year and the past 2 years. So a 3-year sort of look at what property sales are doing. And then to speak very sort of broadly, that is compared with how they're actually listed in the grand list. The idea being that we want to make sure that what we're valuing properties for and how they're listed on the grand list and therefore how they're taxed are in line in general with what they would go for, fair market value. And as we know that does not, those two things do not necessarily keep in lockstep. So the common level of appraisal is a calculation that comes out of that study for each town that's then applied to the tax rate. So it's a way of sort of calibrating the tax rate that town is responsible for based on their education spending against their property values to sort of adjust that value and make sure that the tax rate is adjusted to actually capture more accurately what their property should be collecting for property tax. So that's a very sort of broad, I know Chloe got way into the depth, so if that's helpful for that very overarching explanation.
What's the problem it's trying to solve, Madam Chair?
Well, that's why do we do this, I guess, is the question. Why is it necessary that the state equalize the grand list?
Jake, do you want to take that one or?
Sure.
Okay.
I'd be happy to. In Vermont, we have a fairly unique system of statewide education funding, and all of the money goes into a pool, the education fund. If a town has listed values that aren't accurate, then they could be paying more or less than their fair share. And if a lot of years have passed since the town last reappraised, there's a good likelihood that the listed values are not the fair market values. So that's why we need to equalize. For example, Burlington this year has a CLA of 72%, I think, which means that property is generally listed for around 72% of its fair market value. if Burlington was actually taxed on those listed values without any adjustment, they would be getting a tax break of, I don't know, about 28%. So that's why it exists. Yeah, it's because of our statewide funding system.
Thank you.
Can I ask
Senator
a quick?
Bray, I'm a half inch off.
When I chat with people about this, I just let me double check, make sure I'm thinking of it the right way. I think if CLA is creating sort of a virtual, instantaneous, appraisal for the whole state of Vermont, it brings everyone up to the same moment in time. You're doing it mathematically because some of the appraisals are old, some are current, but you pull everyone in. It's as though everyone got appraised. Well, it's a 3-year window, but everyone got appraised at an instant. Isn't that sort of another way to look at it? So, okay.
Yeah, it definitely aspires to put everyone at 100% of fair market value. It's not a perfect science, and the Division of Property Valuation Review is not saying to an individual property owner that we think this is your actual value. What we are doing is calculating a general adjustment factor for your town based on our study to try to make it sure that all towns are around 100% of fair market value.
Okay. I think we can continue. I'm not seeing other questions. Jill, you're muted.
Let me see if I can screen share while another question.
Senator
comes in.
Bray has another question.
Sorry, the other half of that. So within a town, then it's up to a property owner to speak to their own Board of Civil Authority or whatever, if they think their value is out of line with the town. So there's the state getting equilibrated, and then within the town, it becomes a personal responsibility to make sure your property value is not out of whack.
Coefficient of dispersion. Next.
I knew this would come up. All right.
Yeah, the tax department does produce another statistic that Senator McDonald just mentioned called coefficient of dispersion. And that gets at something, what you just brought up, Senator Bray, of equity within a town. For example, if you're in Burlington and the CLA is 72%, that you would kind of want all the sales to happen to generally be around that 72% ratio. But if some sales are happening at 72% and other ones are at 120%, you have a problem because it's not equitable within a town. So that's part of the equalization study. And we offer that to towns to let them know about equity within the town. And in fact, if the coefficient of dispersion is over 20 points, a town is required by law to reappraise at that point. But also, you're right about the other thing too. If a individual property owner feels like their valuation is out of whack, they would appeal that to their listers.
Thank you.
I think we were on Jill.
Right, let's see. All right, I think, are you folks able to see my screen? I have a section of our annual report up.
Yeah, can you make it a little larger?
Sure thing.
There you go. Don't even need glasses. Okay.
So as we were saying, so every year we complete the equalization study. It wraps up in December so that we can publish this information for you folks in January. The report is now, as of this testimony, is now up on our webpage. There's lots of really interesting data in there. There's sort of a statewide snapshot about a lot of these pieces. What I'm showing now is just the statewide CLA snapshot, but there are several tables further through the report that outline the CLA, the equalized education property values, and a lot of those parcel count, all that stuff by municipality. And the reason that this is ready, we will be bringing you folks hard copies. I think we're going to mail them to you. Normally I come into your committee with a handful of them because the PVR annual report, it's about 100 pages. And because it is kind of a handy reference, it's one of the few things that, that I know we still like to provide hard copy to your committees. So that will be coming, but it is now available on our webpage. And I think it's actually on your documents list under our testimony today. So I think some of the questions that had come up last week with Chloe, just to make sure that we have time to address them, you folks were asking about, do we have a sense of how many municipalities have a lower homestead rate than non-residential homestead rate or higher homestead rate than a non-residential rate? Because that has definitely fluctuated over time. We do have that this year there's 87 towns that actually have a higher homestead rate than a non-homestead rate. So it is a little less than half, but that's a sizable number of towns for whom their homestead rate has actually creeped up past the non-residential rate. Let's see. Another question that you folks were interested in is learning a little bit more about the COD. So that's the coefficient of dispersion. So that's another calculation that comes out of the study that ensures that even within the different categories of property, when there are enough properties within that category in the town, how those are being appraised as well, to make sure that Jake's house in Montpelier and my house in Montpelier are not completely out of whack. I always pick on Montpelier because that's where I live, but I do have an example of their current sort of snapshot. And I know we are on our way to be reappraising. We are in the process of a reappraisal because, as you can see, I'm hoping you can see my page. Our CLA is really getting down towards the 85%, which means that it's pretty out of whack. This map that I'm showing, this is just an example. This is on our website. You could look at this if you don't really like to look through the PVR annual report. It's a pretty handy.
Excuse me, Jill.
data.
Your screen hasn't changed. We're still looking at that table. I think,
Okay, thank you for letting me know. All right, let's see here. All right, do you see the web page? I'm sorry, thank you for pointing that out. Right, so this is an interactive map that you can use if you're interested in just digging a little bit deeper. It has the breakdown by the different categories if you're interested in what those are going for and what those were noted in the study. The Black Diamond notes the statewide CLA, which is ticking down. So I think this year it's around 93%. So what that means is, very broadly speaking, when all lumped together, that Vermont overall is assessed at about 93% of their, or appraised at 93% of their likely fair market value. One of the challenges that we hear from towns quite a bit, we have field staff, the district advisors, Christy oversees that team, that towns really have a hard time finding appraisal firms to do this work. It requires a fair amount of data collection. It requires, a certain statistically significant amount of review of the properties. And a lot of the towns right now, and I think that's actually another data set available on this page, have gone well over 10 years since their last reappraisal. So as Jake mentioned, there is a threshold for when we have to actually require a town to reappraise. A town can always choose to do that on their own, or if they're starting to see their CLA is really consistently changing too far one way or the other, they often do that voluntarily. But each year, as a result of the equalization study that we just finished, we do identify ones that have either significant CLA shifts of more than 5% of their CLA, and we do identify the ones that are required to reappraise. So those are ones that either fell under 85% or over 115%. There's usually about a dozen to 18 of those every year. But then now we have quite the backlog of those. The towns are willing to do that. The legislature does appropriate an annual per parcel payment to the towns for reappraisals, so they can sort of build up that fund, and then they have that money to pay a firm. But it is very difficult to find firms. A lot of the firms have a several year wait list for reappraisals. So through no fault of the towns, as their values are changing, they're often stuck with some pretty significant CLA impacts on their tax rate until they can get that reappraisal done.
We've also had issues with in-home visits for reappraisals due to pandemic.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Senator.
Okay, Senator Bray, you have a question.
Yeah, very quick question. How would farms up here. I mean, I know we're in Montpelier. I'm guessing there's still some farmland there's farmland in Montpelier, so
There's no active farms in Montpelier.
none. Okay. Is there, so if I
Dairy
were to
farms,
come with
at
a farm,
least.
there'd be a category. Oh, there we go. I just saw one. Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah, see if I can find one that has a little more.
Northfield should have some. East Montpelier should have some. Cabot definitely has them.
And our division also does oversee the current use program, and there is a whole section in the annual report that breaks down the current use savings by municipality and the sort of statewide overall picture of current use. The farms question made me think of that. Let's see. So this is a handy map. I'm happy to send this to Faith as well to share with you folks. It's a relatively new tool that we have, but it also includes when the last reappraisal was. So you can see this one actually wasn't too long ago. Northfield must have done it in 2015, but some of them are far, far older. The median, R1 is the residential with less than 6 acres, I believe. So lots of handy stuff in this map in addition to the PVR annual report. Let's see. Another question you folks had was the difference between how an appraiser or a lister would value a homestead versus a house site. So the homestead is all the contiguous property, including the businesses or the buildings rather that aren't used for business or rental. So that might be several acres. And then the house site is actually specifically valued for the up to 2 acres for the purposes of calculating the income sensitivity payment. So the lister actually does have to create both a homestead and a house site value in their local appraisal program.
Okay, any questions?
Yes, sir. Senator
I have
Sorokin.
a
I
question.
can't see there. Senator Sirotkin.
Just on that last point, they have to do it for every house site and 2 acres, or just for the people who apply for income sensitivity? And when do they do that? After they apply for income sensitivity?
I think, and Christy could correct me if I'm wrong, I think they actually do it regardless so that value is ready and established in the event that there is a declaration, because that might also change over time. So I think they do establish that value regardless. So it's
For-
already there.
For every property in the state of Vermont?
Well, that has a residential building on it. Yep.
Wow. Okay. Madam Chair, can I go back to one question? You don't have to answer this now. Maybe you have more in your presentation. Just in like 30 seconds, how does it get to the point where let's say an Airbnb house can be taxed at a lower rate than a Vermonter's house?
I could answer that. So Senator Sorokin, the non-homestead rate is not affected by education spending. The homestead rate is. As education spending, and this is by per pupil, goes up, the homestead rate goes up. There's actually a point mathematically where if you're at that point of per pupil spending, your homestead rate will start to exceed your the non-homestead rate for the town. And for this year, that number is about $17,000 per pupil.
Okay.
So in that scenario, any property that's used for, not a residence, so it could be an Airbnb rental, it could be a restaurant, it could be an office building, anything that's taxed at as non-homestead would be at a lower rate than homestead.
Is the homestead rate and the non-homestead rate, is that exclusive of any municipal taxes that are collected?
Yeah, those are totally separate.
Yes.
We were just talking about education taxes, and the muni taxes have no CLA involved, and it's just what the municipality does is just take the money they need, divide by the municipal grand list, and that's how they get their rate.
So the tourists that come to Vermont or the people who own lodging property like that, they contribute to the education fund and to the education of our students, but only to a certain point. So when school budgets are very high, we stop asking them to contribute at the same rate, essentially. That was not asked very articulately, but it's just the optics to me of, you know, a rental house being taxed at less than a Vermonter's house just seems wrong.
There's really only two categories of property. There's homestead and non-homestead. Non-homestead is everything that's not homestead. So that could be a rental house, it could be a restaurant, it could be an office building, it could be somebody's camp, anything that's not a homestead. And that's really all there is. In some towns, Jill had the statistic before, but I think it's 83 this year. The non-homestead rate is actually lower than the homestead rate. But you know, the tourists are also contributing the meals and rooms tax. 25% of that goes to the education fund. And they're probably contributing in other ways too.
Well, isn't there a situation, Jake, where I think I one time missed my filing for a homestead, and if I was in one of those towns, I'd probably be better off missing my filing as a homestead and get taxed at a lower rate?
Yeah, that situation exists, but the town has can assess penalties. I think it's 8% penalty if the non-homestead rate is lower than the homestead rate.
Say that again?
The town can assess you a penalty.
If you've misrepresented it.
If you've misrepresented.
Yeah. And we knew when we divided out the homestead and non-homestead that eventually they would shift position. And Senator McDonald probably remembers the reason we did it, because the non-homestead owners, business owners primarily, said, look, we don't get to vote on the school budgets. Many of us don't live in this town, but we've got to pay for the school bills. And so they were separated, but we do adjust them annually so that they rise, I believe, at the same rate. Have I really messed that up?
No, Madam Chair, you've come very close.
Close. I'll take this as horseshoes.
Madam Chair, when Act 60 passed, all the commercial industrial properties, the non-residential properties, their taxes went up and down based on what the people in their town had voted. So if you were a high spending town, the non-residential property tax rates were high, and if you were a low spending town, they were low. And under your chairmanship, Madam Chair, in 2003, we separated the two. We went to Act
68.
It was the modification of Act 60, and we said, commercial industrial property, they don't have a vote in town, they don't have a say in town. It's they shouldn't be subject to the whims of individual towns. And we proposed in the Senate that the tax rate for non-residential property be the average tax rate for all residential property. And that while it might move up and down a little bit, it was the same in all the towns. And that didn't pass. It just didn't pass because we weren't ready for it. And we said, generally believing that there was a good idea and that we would deal with that in the subsequent legislatures. And we simply haven't dealt with it. So it's still hanging out there. But that was the proposal, that the non-residential property would be the same throughout the state based on,
I'm going to have to
I'll
It-
stop.
No,
I'll
no,
stop.
I am about
Yeah,
to
yeah.
turn authority over to you because I need to leave for e-board.
Oh, then I
So
can
I
go
will
on forever.
leave it to you to finish up this discussion, but I need to leave for my other discussion. So
Madam-
I think I got two folks with questions.
Okay, so I stop. Go ahead.
You start.
You're in charge now. Goodbye.
But now that I'm the chair, is there someone else who would like to speak? Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Jake and Jill. The CLA is such a scintillating topic and guys did a great job with talking about it. I just want to underscore some of the questions that Senator Sorokin was bringing up about the non-homestead rate. There are a lot of categories within non-homestead, and I do think that it is worthy of sort of picking that apart and looking at the various categories of non-homestead, particularly second homeowners and the rate at which they're charged versus, Vermont-owned small businesses, for example, is one where I think that it's questionable why they have the same rate. And so I think as we're looking at sort of the tax commission report and recommendations, this might be a good thing to come back to. And I see Jill has put something up on the screen.
Just thought it might be helpful to show that there are currently, there are 15 different categories that properties are listed under on the grand list. That was helpful to illustrate your point.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're not all created equally. So I think it's worthy of a conversation about what are we really, what is the message we're sending to each of these individual categories and the rate being the same, and whether or not we should really pick it apart a little bit more. Not that we necessarily want to make our funding formula that much more complicated, but it's certainly worth a conversation about our tax policy. So thank you, Senator Sorokin, for bringing it up.
Thank you, Senator Hardy. That has been discussed before, and perhaps the chair will decide that that's a good idea to do in the very near future. And I think Massachusetts non-residential property is divided into a dozen different categories. Thank you. Senator Brock, did you have your hand up?
I did not.
Oh, I thought I saw someone with their hand up,
Yeah.
but I'm not able to view folks now. I
Senator
can't see
McDonald,
everybody, so somebody has a question, fire away.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. It's Pearson. Just to clarify, am I right that non-residential tax rates are just set by the legislature? There's no automatic adjustment or anything. Isn't that correct?
You're asking me?
Well, I guess I was asking our witnesses, but anybody, it's just
For the first 10 years after 2003, the two rates went up and down together as recommended by the administrations and the tax departments. And since then, they have tracked slightly differently for a variety of reasons. But the tax department might want to comment on the reasons.
Yeah, first of all, I should have clarified this before, but I didn't. The non-homestead rate is what used to be called the non-residential rate. They changed the name of it. The reason that they changed the name is because people thought that it was something charged to owners who aren't residents, but it obviously is not. It's just any property that's not homestead. So that's the first thing. In answer to your question, Senator Pearson, the non-homestead rate by town is just the statewide rate divided by the CLA for that town. So they are different town to town, but there's a statewide rate, and it only varies based on that assessment thing that we were talking about at the beginning.
And this legislature changes that rate occasionally, but there's no formula. There's no, other than as you say, the CLA, there's nothing automatic that happens to that tax rate, correct?
Right. When we write the letter, the commissioner's December 1st letter, we have to follow statute that tells us to to calibrate it so that the change in the average bill is the same for homestead property pairs, anyone with non-homestead property, and those who pay based on income. So we have to do a pretty complicated mathematical exercise between tax and the Joint Fiscal Office to do that. But then after that, the way the place where the rates eventually end up really reflects just the priorities of the legislature in that year. And a couple of years ago, actually, the non-homestead rate and the homestead rate actually used to be a little bit closer, but now the non-homestead rate is, I think, about 10 cents higher.
And my last clarifying question, a couple of years ago, I looked at this and I want to say 114 towns had non-homestead rates that were lower than homestead rates. Are we still in about that range of the universe? About half the towns where, to my mind, it's upside down?
It's now down to 83 that are lower with the non-homestead rate.
Thank you.
Any other
So
questions?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Nope. Yeah, go ahead. Ms.
I was just
Ryan.
going to say tables for all of this information are all in this PDF report, and then there's some deeper dive data. So if you ever want to look, I was going to try to pull up, but maybe in the interest of time, I'll wait. But it has all of those sort of side by side, so you can really see, and you can see it by town, and you can see it by county, and you do sort of see those things that pop up that sort of make you realize, you know, the impacts of that particular economic status of that particular town. But you can really spend a lot of time there, and I'm happy to come back anytime. And like I said, we are going to be mailing you folks hard copies in addition to this digital copy. I know we didn't have a lot of time, so I apologize for the rush.
A comment in Senator Pearson, in the 2000 to 2010 was a period of rapid home values went up at a rate, appraisal rate that was substantially higher than businesses. And it was a ratio of about 3 to 1. They were home prices were going up 3 times as fast as business appraisals. And the result was that the amount of it caused a disparity between the values paid by non-residential and the portion paid by residential taxes, and that began to get out of whack a little bit. And that counted in part for why the rates have been adjusted differently. So there, often in these discussions, there are 3 variables, and we talk about 2 and miss the 3rd. And the next time we talk about a different 2 and miss the 3rd one. I'm now rambling, so I will stop and ask if there are any more questions that folks have for the tax department. If senators don't have any more questions, I do not have the agenda before me. Is there a next item on here? Yes, Mr. Feldman.
Remember your last item.
Just saying thank you, and I got to go to the e-board meeting too.
Okay.
Thank you. We're happy to come
Have
back
fun. It's
anytime.
exciting stuff.
Yeah, it would be good to have you back later in the session. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Happy to. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Is Faith available?
I'm here,
Senator
Senator.
McDonald, that was the last item on our current list.
That's exactly what I was trying to learn. So I guess we are done, and we have a short day, unless there are any other questions or considerations you would like to bring to the chair prior to tomorrow's meetings. If not, then we are adjourned.